Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The House Beneath. Chapter 1. The house on Sycamore Hill. Megan Turner had always felt a certain pull toward the past, an instinct, perhaps, to discover what had come before her, to piece together the fragments of lives long gone. When she first heard about the house on Sycamore Hill, she was intrigued by the whispered stories that followed it, stories of disappearances, of students who had walked in and never returned, of shadows moving in rooms where no one should be. It was a place that seemed suspended in time, frozen in some unsettling moment of its history. A few weeks ago, when she'd first arrived at the university, she thought little of the rumors. After all, students in a new town had to make their own legends, didn't they? But the house, and its aura of mystery, had a strange, magnetic pull on her. The fact that it was available for rent in the first place should have been a red flag, but Megan was drawn to it. It was cheap, far cheaper than any other place she could find near campus, and it offered the kind of solitude she needed to study. Her phone was off. The university was no longer just a dream, it was now her reality, one that she was determined to conquer. The house itself was magnificent, an old Victorian mansion that towered above the others on Sycamore Hill, casting long shadows over the streets below. It was one of those houses that seemed to have a life of its own, where the creaks of its floors and the groan of its old wooden beams felt like echoes from the past, stories waiting to be uncovered. The moment she stepped across the threshold, Megan felt a chill, a shiver that prickled her skin like a warning. But she dismissed it. She always dismissed things. It was part of her nature. She signed the lease with an uneasy smile, the landlord, a pale, thin man with hollow eyes, handing her the keys as if he was relieved to be rid of the place. No explanations, no stories about why the house was so cheap. But Megan hadn't needed any of that. She was starting fresh, and there was something about the house, something about its hidden corners and forgotten spaces, that stirred something inside her. A desire to discover, to unearth the stories that lay buried beneath the surface. The first night was uneventful, too uneventful, Megan thought. She wandered through the creaking hallways, her footsteps echoing in the silence, but nothing seemed to happen. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of the house's age, but there was nothing overtly wrong about it. Just the loneliness of an old house, unused for years, waiting to be filled again. It wasn't until she found the trapdoor that everything began to change. Chapter 2. The trapdoor. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Megan discovered the door hidden beneath a thick, dusty rug in the far corner of the basement. The basement was vast, much larger than she had expected, and the air down there was musty, carrying the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. She had been unpacking the last of her boxes when she stumbled upon the rug, its edges worn and frayed. Curious, she pulled it back, revealing the faint outline of a trapdoor, partially obscured by years of dust and grime. Megan crouched down, brushing off the dust with her fingers. The metal of the door gleamed faintly beneath the dirt, a rusted handle protruding from the center. It was old, but not ancient. She tugged at the handle, and the door creaked open with a groan, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into pitch-black darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't sure why, but the sight of that dark space beneath her feet filled her with a sense of dread, a visceral fear that twisted in her gut. But there was something else too, something compelling, pulling her toward it. Maybe it was the idea of a secret, of something forgotten and hidden away, waiting to be found. She had always been drawn to the unknown. Steeling herself, Megan took a deep breath and stepped down onto the first step, the creaking sound of the wood beneath her feet amplifying in the silence. The air grew colder as she descended, and her breath came out in visible puffs, like wisps of smoke. The tunnel ahead of her was narrow, the walls uneven, as though hastily constructed. The stairs seemed to stretch on forever, and though Megan had no idea where the stairs were leading, she couldn't stop herself from continuing. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, and the closer she got to the bottom, the more she felt a strange sensation of being watched. Her skin tingled with the weight of unseen eyes, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something, or someone, down here with her. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a low-ceilinged corridor, its walls damp and covered in mold. The air felt stale, thick with the scent of rot. Megan ran her fingers along the cold stone walls, her breath catching as she noticed the faint outline of another door at the far end of the hall. The door was made of iron, its surface scarred with scratches and gouges, as though something had tried to claw its way through. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but she approached the door anyway, curiosity winning over fear. She gripped the rusted handle, and with a sharp pull, the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside was a series of strange, makeshift symbols drawn on the stone walls, their shapes jagged and erratic. The air was thick with the smell of something ancient, something that felt wrong. Megan's eyes darted over the symbols, her mind racing to make sense of them, but they were unlike anything she had ever seen before. It was then that she noticed the floor beneath her feet. The stone tiles were cracked and broken, revealing a network of thin, black roots that seemed to pulse, moving slightly as if alive. For the briefest moment, Megan thought she saw something shift in the corner of the room, something darker than the shadows that clung to the walls. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Only the faint whisper of movement in the air. Megan shook her head, her heart pounding. She was just imagining things, she told herself. Just the unease of being in a place like this. But as she took a step forward, a sudden, chilling whisper filled the room, soft, unintelligible, but unmistakably a voice. It seemed to come from deep within the stone walls, rising from the very foundations of the house. Megan took a step back, her pulse racing, as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. She spun around, looking for the source, but there was nothing except the sound of her own breathing, the overwhelming feeling that something was waiting. Chapter 3, The Labyrinth. That night, Megan tried to shake off the feeling that had settled into her bones. She convinced herself that it was just the house settling, that the whisper was nothing more than the wind or her overactive imagination. But even as she tried to convince herself, she couldn't ignore the fact that the house, this place, wasn't as empty as it seemed. The next few days were uneventful, but the tension lingered. Megan could hear strange noises at night, scraping sounds, low murmurs, and sometimes, what sounded like footsteps from the floor above her. But every time she went to investigate, there was nothing. No one. Just the silence of a house filled with too many secrets. And then, on the fifth night, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder. More persistent. Unmistakably real. Megan stood in the doorway of the cellar, her mind racing, her heart pounding as the whispers began to form words. "Come deeper." The voice was seductive, low and guttural, echoing from the darkness. It called to her in a way that made her blood run cold. Without thinking, Megan descended into the depths again. As she walked through the labyrinth of tunnels, the shadows seemed to warp and twist around her. The walls closed in, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Something was here. Something waiting. And then, as she rounded a corner, she saw it. A figure, pale, emaciated, and covered in layers of decaying flesh. Its eyes were black pits, endless and empty, staring into Megan's soul. The thing didn't move, didn't speak. It simply waited. And the silence that followed was deafening. It was only when Megan tried to turn and run that she realized the tunnels had no exit. The walls closed in. The shadows reached out. And the darkness swallowed her whole. Story 2: The Shattered Soul. The sky over Los Angeles was a sickly shade of gray, its dull hue pressing down on the city like the weight of 1,000 unspoken regrets. Marcus Reed sat in his office on the 10th floor of a sleek, modern building that overlooked the sprawling metropolis. The sound of traffic hummed faintly in the distance, but Marcus had long since stopped hearing it. He was a man consumed by his own thoughts, by the quiet desolation that lingered in his chest like an unhealed wound. As a psychologist, Marcus was revered. His patients came to him with their brokenness, their pain, and they left with a sense of closure, or at least, that was the goal. He had the keen ability to untangle their problems, to offer them a sense of clarity, but when it came to his own life, his own inner turmoil, Marcus had long ago given up on finding any real peace. His marriage had dissolved years ago, his relationships with family members were strained at best, and his personal happiness was a distant memory. He had buried himself in his work, focusing on the suffering of others to avoid confronting his own. But as with all things in life, the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how much you try to outrun it. The door to his office opened with a soft click, and Marcus glanced up, his tired eyes meeting those of his new patient. Claire, a woman in her early 30s, with long, dark hair and an air of quiet intensity. She stepped into the room with the hesitance of someone who had been to more than a few therapists before, but there was something about her that intrigued Marcus from the moment she walked in. "Good afternoon, Claire," he said, gesturing to the armchair across from his desk. "Please, have a seat." Claire nodded, her movements deliberate, but her eyes were different. There was an unsettling depth to them, as though they held centuries of knowledge and sorrow, things no one should have experienced. She sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and Marcus took a moment to study her. He had seen thousands of patients in his career, but there was something about Claire that felt off. "So, tell me," Marcus began, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "What brings you here today?" Claire took a deep breath, her gaze never leaving his. "I've lived many lives, Dr. Reed," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I remember them all." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his professional demeanor slipping into a subtle, polite skepticism. He had heard claims like this before, patients convinced they were reincarnated souls or had experienced past lives. It was a delusion, nothing more. He would be the first to explain it away, to ground it in the context of psychological disorders, but there was something in Claire's tone, something in the way she spoke, that made him pause. "Many lives?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "What do you mean by that?" Claire's eyes seemed to grow distant, as though she were searching for something in the recesses of her mind. "I remember, different faces, different places. I've been a man, a woman, a child. I've lived in different countries, different centuries. But every time, it ends the same way. There's always a moment when something dark comes for me." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine at her words. He leaned forward, instinctively drawn to the mystery of her statement. "What is this dark thing?" he asked, trying to keep his tone professional. Claire swallowed, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. "It's hard to explain. It's a presence, a force. Something that follows me, hunts me, no matter where I go or who I am. It's ancient, something older than time itself." Marcus chuckled softly, dismissing the notion. "Claire, I think what you're describing could be rooted in some deep psychological trauma. Perhaps it's a manifestation of your subconscious mind trying to deal with past memories or unresolved feelings." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at him with an expression that was both curious and knowing, as though she could see through him, into the depths of his very soul. It was a look that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "I know what you're thinking," she said quietly. "You think I'm delusional. But I'm not. And you'll see that soon enough." Marcus was about to respond with a calm, reassuring statement when Claire spoke again, her voice a whisper that sent a jolt through him. There was a sense of urgency, of impending doom. The wind howled, the trees groaned under its force, and in the distance, he saw a figure, a shadow, dark and unfathomable, creeping toward him, its eyes gleaming with an ancient hunger. His heart raced, and he blinked, suddenly back in his office. Claire was still sitting across from him, her gaze softening, but there was an unmistakable understanding in her eyes. "You remember now," she said gently, as if soothing a child. "You're starting to remember." Marcus swallowed, his mouth dry. What did you do to me?" Claire's lips curled into a faint, almost sad smile. "I didn't do anything. I'm just the catalyst. The memories are always there, Marcus. You've always known. You've seen it, too." Marcus froze. For a moment, the air in the room felt too thick, too heavy. He cleared his throat, trying to brush off the unease that had suddenly gripped him. "What do you mean by that?" Claire's gaze sharpened, her eyes locking onto his with unnerving precision. "You've seen it, Marcus. The darkness that follows us both. It's been with you for a long time, hasn't it? You just don't remember it yet. But you will." Marcus felt a shiver of dread crawl up his spine. There was something about her words, something about her certainty, that stirred something deep within him, something he had buried so far down. He had convinced himself it was nothing more than a distant nightmare. But now, as Claire's words hung in the air, he felt the old fear rise again. For a brief moment, Marcus was back in a different time, in a different place, standing in the midst of a storm. Marcus leaned back in his chair, struggling to maintain his composure. The room felt too small, too suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around him as his mind began to churn, wrestling with the inexplicable sense of familiarity that Claire's words stirred within him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice tight. There's no such thing as this darkness you speak of. Claire's expression softened, pity in her eyes. It's not something you can deny, Marcus. It's something you've been running from your entire life. And now, it's finally time to face it. The room was silent for a long moment, the only sound the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. Marcus's mind raced, but the words kept coming back, echoing in his thoughts. You've seen it, too. And then, like a dam breaking, memories flooded into his consciousness. The vision was fleeting but sharp, too vivid to ignore. It was a memory, no, not just a memory, but a moment of pure terror from another life. A man, young, with dark eyes that mirrored his own, stood in a field, staring at a figure in the distance. The wind whipped through the trees, and the man's chest tightened with the undeniable feeling of something watching him, waiting for him. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble, and as the figure drew closer, it became clear that it wasn't human. The darkness that followed had been waiting for centuries. Who was I? Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Who was I before? Claire's expression softened, her eyes filled with compassion. You were someone else, Marcus. You were the one who betrayed us all. And now, the darkness is coming for you, just as it's coming for me. His hands trembled as the truth settled into his bones like cold steel. He had been here before. He had made this choice before. And now, that ancient evil was coming to collect its due. The terror of the past had come alive once more. You have to stop it, Marcus, Claire said, her voice urgent. We have to stop it together, before it consumes us both. Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of the revelation crashing over him. His past lives had all led to this moment, this reckoning. And now, as the shadows stirred once more, he knew the time had come. He had been running for centuries, but there was nowhere left to hide. The darkness was coming. And it would not be denied. Story 3, The Unseen Hand. Chapter 1. The first sign. Sarah Montgomery sat at the kitchen table, sipping her lukewarm coffee, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the early morning stillness. The house felt empty today, more so than usual. She had gotten used to the loneliness, the silence that had settled in after her husband's death. Still, it was strange how thick the silence could feel at times, pressing against her chest, suffocating the air from her lungs. Her son, Tyler, was still asleep upstairs. He was 13, still at that age where he hadn't quite come to terms with the death of his father. But then again, neither had Sarah. The loss was a wound that hadn't healed, one that continued to bleed, each day a reminder of the life they had once shared. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. Sarah absent-mindedly glanced at the windowsill, where a small ceramic figure of a bird sat. She had placed it there months ago, a remnant of the time when everything had been normal. A time when she and Jack, her late husband, had been a family. But the bird seemed out of place now, somehow, as if it didn't belong here in this house that no longer felt like home. Then, something caught her eye. The bird was gone. Sarah blinked, her mind scrambling to make sense of the strange sight. The windowsill was bare. She sat up straighter, eyes darting around the kitchen. Had Tyler taken it? He had been spending more time upstairs lately, retreating into his room whenever he wasn't in school. But the bird was far too insignificant a thing to interest him. She had placed it there, out of sight, away from his reach. With slow, deliberate movements, she rose from the table and walked over to the windowsill. She looked down, then up, her gaze trailing along the edge of the counter. Nothing. It was just gone. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest. A sense of unease washed over her, the same creeping feeling she had experienced ever since the incident, since Jack's accident. It wasn't just the emptiness of the house that disturbed her, it was the inexplicable moments, the shadows that moved too quickly, the faint whispers that seemed to slip through the cracks in her mind. She shook her head, trying to dispel the creeping sense of dread. "It's just the wind," she muttered to herself. "It must have fallen." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. The bird had not simply fallen. It had been taken. And she couldn't help but feel that the house had something to do with it, something unseen, something that had been watching her for far too long. Chapter 2. The handprints. The day went on uneventfully. Tyler woke up, ate his cereal, and went to school. The silence of the house returned, and for a moment, Sarah almost felt as if things were back to normal. Almost. But the feeling didn't last. Later that afternoon, as she cleaned the living room, Sarah noticed something strange on the window pane. At first, it appeared to be smudges of dirt, faint streaks of grime that could have been left behind by a careless hand. But as she looked closer, the pattern became clear, a handprint. It was not a typical handprint. There were no fingerprints, no smudge of oils left behind by a finger. The print was solid, a pale, ghostly outline of a hand, with long, elongated fingers, the skin almost translucent in its appearance. Sarah felt a chill grip her spine. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. The handprint was still fresh, not an old stain from months ago. She could feel the weight of it, the unnatural presence that seemed to pulse from the glass. It was as if the handprint were waiting for her, beckoning her closer. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest as she reached out, almost against her will, to touch the glass. The surface was cool beneath her fingers, but the sensation didn't feel right. It felt wrong. As if something cold and malignant was waiting just beyond the surface, eager to pull her in. The handprint faded under her touch, leaving nothing behind except the faintest trace of an impression. Sarah stepped back, her mind racing. She glanced around the room, but there was no sign of Tyler. He was still at school, she reminded herself. She was alone. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She could almost hear the whisper of something moving through the air, brushing past her ear, just out of reach. It was the same feeling she'd had all those months ago, the sensation that something had come with Jack's death, something that was now part of their home, part of their lives. Chapter 3. A pattern emerges that night. Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling like a vortex in her mind. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, seemed to be a message, some kind of warning. The handprint on the window kept haunting her thoughts, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only the beginning. Around 3 in the morning, she finally gave in to her restless thoughts. She slid out of bed, pulled on her slippers, and padded downstairs to the living room. The house was cold, the kind of cold that felt unnatural, as if the warmth had been sucked out of the air. When she entered the living room, Sarah froze in place. The handprint had reappeared, this time on the window above the couch. But this time, the handprint was different. It wasn't alone. There were several others, smaller prints, as though a child had pressed their hand against the glass in some sort of desperate, frantic gesture. And they were moving. The prints seemed to shift, growing darker, more defined, as if they were slowly coming to life. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she backed away, her legs trembling beneath her. She needed to get Tyler, to get out of this house. But just as she turned toward the stairs, a soft whisper brushed her ear. "Sarah." The voice was cold and distant, but unmistakable. She knew it, even though she couldn't place it. It was a voice she hadn't heard in over a year. A voice she had buried deep in her mind. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. The air grew heavier, the silence pressing down on her chest. She heard it again, faint but distinct. "Sarah. You can't escape." Her pulse quickened, panic rising in her chest. She turned back to the window. The handprints had grown more distinct, more real. And they were moving closer. Chapter 4. The history of Greendale. Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that something had been unleashed, that the house had always been waiting for her, for Tyler. The whispers grew more frequent, and she noticed other things, objects moving on their own, lights flickering at odd times, and the constant sense of being followed. It wasn't just the house. It was something else, something that had been lying dormant, waiting to be awakened. Desperate for answers, Sarah began digging into the history of Greendale, hoping to uncover some clue about the malevolent spirit that seemed to be haunting her. What she found sent a chill through her veins. Greendale, once a thriving town, had been the site of a series of gruesome events, stretching back decades. There were rumors of a violent murder, the story of a man named Thomas Gray, whose family had been killed in a brutal attack in the early 1900s. It was said that Thomas had been a cruel man, one who had tortured and killed his own children before taking his own life. But there was something more. As Sarah continued to research, she discovered an unsettling pattern. Many of the houses in the town had been built on the site of the Gray family home. And worse, many of the residents had reported strange occurrences, strange disappearances, always linked to the same unsettling presence. It was then that Sarah realized the truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a conduit, a portal to something darker, something far more ancient. And it had chosen her. This is just the beginning of Sarah's descent into the terrifying world of the unseen hand.
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting, just for you.